doing was, without knowing it, doing something that had no, I wouldn't say it had no precedent at all, but really it was not a done thing. You know, journalists didn't just go off and you were, and that's in fact something that I write about in my introduction. That everyone kept asking me, how much were you paid? And I found that so upsetting because, you know, one was really kind of, it is a completely independent project. But you know, that was the idea that if you were doing a biography, you were doing it because you had been commissioned by, you know, and of course, Sarabhai comes from a family that is an important family and a kind of affluent family. So it seems like sort of obvious thing. And I had to keep saying, but no, I wasn't paid, and no, this is my own project. So coming to now the kind of actual research work and how I looked at it. So as I said, for me, he was a figure that represented an era of idealism. You know, I became a journalist in 1983. And by that time, I think we'd started moving towards liberalization, which kind of happens in 91, but already by the late 80s. And I guess everyone always feels the same way, that we're losing what we had before. So maybe to an extent, I was kind of curious about what was in the minds of people who made, particularly the middle class. And I think it was a big question when I became a journalist. That was the time when people were talking about why does the middle class not enter politics? And so I think in a way I was kind of going back to look at what was this era when industrialists, scientists, professionals, lawyers, etc. They got into politics. They kind of got into public life. So what was it about this era? And of course, he was, to me, such a fascinating character because he was someone who came from a very wealthy family, but all his work was driven by a concern, and we can come to the democratic impulse later, but an idea of helping the poorest or helping the most marginalized. You know, so that was the idea of taking very sophisticated technology or taking his status, doing whatever he could because he had the means to do so much. Not give money, not philanthropy, but through his own efforts and through his own kind of understanding of how the world worked, etc. Where he would use it for to kind of uplift. That was the idea, and so. But there were so many other kind of factors, and of course nuclear weapons, because he becomes a very critical part, and space technology as well. The idea of whether you use it for defense or whether you use it for development, all these kind of big questions, which to me. So there were kind of, so as I said, I was interested in the era, I was interested in the people who made up that era and the circumstances, the environment of the time. I was interested in the questions because, you know, they're shaping our present, the decisions people made at that time. So I was very interested in that. And I thought he had a very complex understanding. His was not a binary approach. His was an approach where he looked at many things and then, and you felt he would evolve as he went along. But the thing is that I wanted to understand him. And that's where the leap of faith. So first of all, I had very little data. I mean, there was very little material. And I was a little taken aback to discover how little material there was. Some of it I couldn't access because of the Official Secrets Act. Some of it was it just wasn't. I think maybe we don't preserve things as we don't have an archival instinct as perhaps the West does. So it was difficult, but I was doing it. So I went and I used all kinds of, I think it just spread my net very wide. And that's, I think, a great thing as a journalist, an advantage where you really can do anything to get your story, as we say, so you, and so kind of, so the leap of faith where I actually interpret what might have been going on in Vikram's mind, particularly as you say, his approach towards love or the bomb, so many things that I had to it was like being a detective and saying, okay, why? What was it? So yes, I interpreted. I used my kind of instinct, but I think my interpretation is built of things. I mean, I'm not making it up. I am making the most likely sort of speculative kind of conclusion from data. So for instance, I had little bits of his diary. He didn't really, I mean, I wasn't even shown a proper diary, but there were jottings, he had like a kind of little thing where he said, when he's telling himself, reminding himself about buying something or jotting down a bill he might have paid off or whatever. So I had those things, for instance, that give me some idea of what's going through his mind. Then other things, like I'll give you an example. Was when I came across this book by an Australian scientist who happened to be in Cambridge at the time when he was in Cambridge. And there's no indication that they knew each other, had met each other, but reading her book, because hers was an autobiography, it was a sort of memoir. She talks about how it was the coldest winter, and she describes the winter and how it felt when spring came. And so I know he's in that environment, and so I'm not making it up. The data is there, and I'm just applying it to understand what the conditions would have been like for when he was there. And particularly his thinking about weaponization, the nuclear question, etc. I really had to, and I had to kind of understand it. It was very important to me, but it was as important as even the personal parts of his life. But as I said, I'm using things he might have said in a letter, or someone else might have said in a letter, or someone has said in an interview, and I'm kind of weaving it together as the most probable, the most possible. So I would say that I would stand by it in terms of, I would say this is the evidence, and then I'm thinking about it. It is, yes, I'm kind of mulling over it, and
yeah, no, that's what sort of like really fascinated me, simply because it just made him reading Vikram Sarabhai such a human act almost. I could understand, okay, this is a person, this is not just a personality well into the past, but it's relatable. Like the parts where you talk about, like towards the latter part of the book where you are talking about his conflict with nuclear weapons versus nuclear energy, and how that comes up, and how his impulse is more towards making sure that it eventually helps the common people of the country, and how he was like not really didn't really want to participate in the jingoistic culture of weaponry. So that was like, that those readings just made him relatable, because we now know how important those decisions must have been. And again, like I said, I keep on going back to the parts about his relationships with his wife, with his partner, because again, those things gave us a sense of very subtle mindset about like what sort of ideas of love was concurrent amongst social elites at that point. So I really love that, and I'll get back to it as a question eventually. But I wanted to also ask you about how you began the book. I was like very excited about how I read it, because you do not begin with the life of Vikram Sarabhai, but instead you began with the history of Ahmedabad, way into the past. And then you go into describing sort of the caste community cultures of what would then become the lineage of Vikram. So even before we came to read about him, we know his background, we know his privileges, and you've set them, you've set the stage. And you also specify, of course, the absolute centrality of Ahmedabad's relationship with colonial capital through cotton, and how that gave Vikram Sarabhai a head start, which no one, like not many people would. It's a different issue, like you said, that he decided to build upon that and his parents in a way where he was contributing to developmentalism as opposed to philanthropy, which so many of the other capitalist classes were doing. So again, but the way you set the background in the initial chapter, I thought that was brilliant, because it's also a great narrative strategy, because the readers are not left to think about these things as an afterthought and suddenly be like, oh my God, but he was so privileged. But you start with that. So what made you choose, like, what made you write this way? Was it because of your previous book on Ahmedabad? Or did that come later? Oh.
Yeah, that came later. In fact,
okay.
I wrote Ahmedabad because I was there, and well,
okay.
I saw things that made me think, yeah, Ahmedabad was important at that point to look at. Yeah, no, the reason why I just reread the book, I was looking at it again because it's been some time since I wrote it. I was trying to think. I realized why I look at his background, partly because I think all of it made him the kind of very unconventional and he was a very unique person. I think he was kind of quite different from most people, and I had to understand it myself. How did he become like this? And it's actually kind of important because he's not like a religious saint. So when I say he was evolved, I don't mean like a kind of mystical, a spiritual way, but there was a lot of kind of reflection that seemed to have already gone on before he arrives. And I think that's what his father has done, where his father and the family was also interested in things like psychoanalysis and history and looking at religion. They were Jains, but they at some point left the Jain fold. But Jainism becomes very important because when he's taking a decision on nuclear weaponization, one of the criticisms, because there were a lot of scientists around him who felt that, of course, India must make the bomb. And I'm not saying that actually Sarabhai's view was very complicated. And, it's not just straightforward, yes or no. It was much more complex. But this criticism that, he was a Jain and they don't believe in violence, right? So I had to, so eventually it becomes quite an important strand to understand. And so, which is why I talk about the Jainism in the beginning, like how Jainism is important in the city, but also in, what it meant for his family, because his family had a kind of more unconventional view. They were not the religion for his father was more a sort of, it was more, I think, a more complex thinking about higher things, as he used to say. But he was not about, for instance, taking pragmatic decisions where he kind of shoots these dogs which have, got rabies and that kind of, the community's against him because he does that and stuff. So I needed to show that. That was sort of one of the sort of strands. And then this business about being an Ahmedabadi, it's kind of slightly complicated, and I have I guess a greater understanding now since I've actually written a book about the city. So the kind of value for money, the idea, it's not, people say Gujaratis are money-minded, or it's a kind of slightly more complicated than that. It's the idea that you must get what you pay for, the most cost-effective solution. And that again becomes important in Sarabhai's thinking about space. How he built the space program, what the motives were, and how he kind of, it was not lavish. He was not lavish, even though he belonged to one of the richest families in the world at that time. But he was never kind of, he was quite careful with money. And so I think the city becomes important in all those ways. And then finally, the family itself, he comes from this really fascinating family. He comes from this family that has made its money through cotton, but also, Ahmedabadis, and they were bankers. They also said to have funded the opium kind of trade and things like that. So there is that complicated history, which he inherits. And but they also support Gandhi, and both his parents are involved, and his sister and his aunt are completely involved in the. So I needed to show, and also his aunt, while his father is supposed to be this sort of textile king, I mean, who's a big industrialist, his aunt or his father's sister is actually founding the labor movement in Ahmedabad with Gandhi's help. So it's that complicated history that for me was important to kind of backlight in a way, Vikram, because he has all these choices as well. As I also mentioned, he never becomes an activist. He doesn't become a political activist. Yeah, while his sister does. His sister, takes part in, and she's actually part of the Quit India and all those sort of agitations. So he doesn't do that, but he sort of so clearly has his mind set. So I needed to show this backdrop, see where he came from.
Yeah, no, that's actually like really clear, because so many of the things that you actually do in the first bit of his like childhood and like just before childhood, like, his parents' life and so on, that actually has a lot of resonance later, like in the portions when you actually talk about how he was dealing with his colleagues, or how he was working with people who were working so-called under him. So those sort of behavior, it seems like in terms of the narrative, it connected very well. So I really get the impulse behind why you did that. We have, I think, like time for like one more question. Okay. So yeah, the other, I mean, we see like once, towards a later part of his life, of course, we wouldn't know that it was the later part. At that point, he died fairly young. But the 1960s show a shift in Sarabhai's life, right? Like you point out, even when it came to nuclear warfare, there was like some sort of ambiguity. And of course, with especially that came with a very closer engagement with the government of India, where he also relinquishes his position as the chief of the family business. And he was also expressing like, irritation with India's bureaucratic culture. And this is a time when, the Babu culture being well entrenched in India's political vocabulary. And I wanted to just like, I wanted to ask you to move out of Vikram Sarabhai and tell me if you thought, what did you think of the world of 60s and 70s and the early days of Indira Gandhi through the work that you read of Vikram Sarabhai?
So it's so interesting because, and it seems so different now. So for instance, a simple thing like taking a flight, you only had one airline, right? I mean, and I've been through that. So I know what it's like, because your flight can suddenly get cancelled and merged with another one because there are not enough passengers. And
it's kind of what it is now.
Well, yes, again. But so I remember what it was like. But I read, so one of the books I read was by Prakash Tandon, who was the first Indian head of Hindustan Lever. I mean, after post-colonial, I think, 50s or whatever. So anyway, so he writes, and he's written this lovely book called Punjabi Saga, and he writes about what it was like, because he had to keep going to talk to the government. He had to keep going to Delhi for something or the other, because all the quotas and the kind of so licenses, etc. You had to deal with the government really often. And he just says, there's this sort of sinking feeling in my heart, knowing that I have to go again, and I don't know what awaits me, what change of policy or whatever. So that was sort of, it reminded me of what it was like then. And then the other interesting thing is, Vikram had a suite at the Ashoka. His family used to always stay there whenever they went for work. And he was also, had a pharmaceutical business. So he used to go for various reasons. It was for scientific work and the idea of the Ashoka and what it meant for the other scientists to come meet him in the morning. And he would say, oh, I don't want this expensive breakfast. Can I get some idli from somewhere? And the scientist, one of his colleagues says, oh God, I would end up eating his expensive breakfast and he would eat the idli. But so it reminded me of how kind of life was fairly circumscribed. And within that, so it was the options were very few. And so you kind of, I'm just thinking, even of the car, if he had to go, he couldn't get a Mercedes. He was given, the pharmaceutical partner abroad wanted to give Vikram two Mercedes or two fancy cars, and he couldn't bring it in because of it was not government policy or whatever. And then, of course, his conversation with, he deals with bureaucrats, right? And then he finds some sympathetic bureaucrats, and there are a lot of unsympathetic bureaucrats who can make life. So you remember that too, how hard it was for people to get things done. And I think that's something about, I guess, writing about Sarabhai, and Bhabha had that same kind of largesse, he had a large ambit. I don't know how else to put it, because these men they came from a certain strata of society, which is not common for, everyone doesn't come from. Bhabha wasn't as wealthy as, but he was connected to the Tatas, so he did come, he was well connected. And so they come from a certain elite, and they're extremely influential, so they can, and they know everyone. And particularly with Vikram's family, his family was, Gandhi was in Ahmedabad, so everyone who mattered in politics came through Ahmedabad and met the Sarabhais. And the Sarabhais are not just, they didn't just keep this nice fancy parlor. They were very active, etc. So even for someone of this sort of from this background, he could, I think, so then he could do what he did to a certain extent, to a large extent, because he was who he was. But you also see the possibility when you see others struggling, or when you see even he struggles at some point with the Babus, with it's almost like you have this large vision, and then you have this stranglehold, and you have to kind of get it through this really narrow pass. And you use all your tactical, you can use all your ability, but it's still, there you are, you kind of, at any point, you're starting a space program, but suddenly some small babu can come and say, well, you don't have permission for putting this electric wire or something like, so it was that. So yes, so that was the world. And I think his world was much freer, because he was who he was. So it was much freer, and, but I think the world was a narrow, constricted world where it was very hard to do things. At the same time, there was such idealism that there was the urge to do big things. So it's a kind of contradictory impulses there.
Yeah, just 1 second. Yeah, like that's very understandable, if right from the book itself, and also because I was thinking like something, he seems to have had concerns and investments, intellectual investments in a lot of issues when it came to sort of the larger idea of developing India, like particularly given that food security was always a question from the 50s and 60s and 70s. And his satellite program, also thinking about it in those terms, that was very interesting for me, because I honestly didn't think of it that way. And before I read this, and I was like, oh, but it makes sense, because that was the pressing need of the time. And we know how important and how huge a crisis that was, because India was just like going through multiple recognized and unrecognized famines. So that again was like, that something was like, okay, today I learned. That was like a very important insight. And like, I'll just like release you from like with one more question, which is again, because you did mention that, you had to reread your own book because a lot of time has passed. Is there something that you would have, redone, some portion that you would have written differently? Just,
Interesting. But I mean, if I was writing the book now, it would be a different book, but then that's because I wrote the earlier book. I mean, because
Yeah.
what I had to do in that book, because I see myself as a writer, not someone who just puts out data. I enjoy the writing process. That's part of why I do it. And but the thing is, I was held back because there was no biography of him. And really, it seems like he's so well known now, but when I was writing the book, I would say to people, younger people, not even younger people, I think, I mean, so many people would have been born in the 60s or 70s, and they would be like, I mean, I was so upset when I remember this woman, she would have been, I'd say born in probably 1970s or something like that. And she said, oh, you're writing about a rich guy. I was like, I had to actually explain. Publishers, many of them who were younger, didn't know who he was. So I had to, and I know it seems incredible right now, but seriously, that was how it was when I was writing the book. To me, he was well known, and I actually, when I thought of writing the book, what I did was I looked at a lot of books on modern India, and I looked at the index at the back to find his name. I didn't find it anywhere. It just was not there. Bhabha was mentioned always. There would be like a couple of, but not much. There would be kind of a sentence or maybe a paragraph. But Sarabhai did not figure anyway. And I would say, go back and look, and you would see that he just did not. He was sort of not there. And I got to know more about him. I mean, I kind of write in my introduction how I knew about him from childhood, etc., etc. But my trajectory was because I wrote a book about television. And he was very critical to, the entry of television. And because I was reading so much about the audiovisual media and the electronic media and the electronics industry, etc., and I came to know about the amount of things he'd done. The Management Institute, the space program, the nuclear. So I think it was my peculiar, my set of interests that led me to him, in a way. But he was not, as I said, he kind of, there was a gap where he was, his name was known, but really not, and certainly not fleshed out. So now having written it, and now the space program, because he was certainly someone who was ahead of his times. His thinking was really, really kind of, he thought far ahead. And so I think it's now kind of his almost the things he kind of had talked of then, their relevance, their importance, their significance is finally sort of now emerging, just maybe because it needed to take the time, but unfortunately, I mean, he isn't alive, but one feels like what he sort of started is now being seen or recognized. So yes, I think, so it's an odd question. How do I answer? I can't write a second book. But it would probably be a book that would, I don't know. I mean, because space is now so big, or at least it always was big, but now it's sort of, has its place more, I think, in public discourse.
Yeah, and I think my sense was that what I found in your book, and that's something that speaks to our present time a lot significantly, and that is the very slow and well-stewed scientific temperament, which sort of connects the entire life of this person and his entire work. And the scientific temperament isn't just about like what we now know as science and technology. The temperament is a mode of understanding knowledge. It's a mode of understanding culture. So that I thought was, if someone reads this book now, like I did, that speaks to our times like very clearly. And it again tells us about like how I began when I was discussing your book initially, that it tells us of how we want to process a complicated time in our own Indian history, but also find ways to sort of see that, okay, there are certain modes of public culture which existed in India, which depended on deliberation, which depended on thinking about the world through through humanity, really, and that's the true scientific temperament. And that, I think, is like it speaks so well and so importantly. Um, but thank you so much for writing this book. I was really, honestly, I had no clue that there would be so little work on Vikram Sarabhai till I read this. And then I was frantically Googling and I was like, what is going on? And then I thought about it, that all the books I've read for part of my research on the 1950s and 60s, they focus on something completely different. And even like one or two books that focus on India's nuclear energy and so on, I think they end up not focusing on Sarabhai too much because he wasn't, an octogenarian who has written his autobiography or something like that. So like the old people made it into all the history because they've written stuff, but it's this young person who like dies so early, even in his contemporary time, he's way below the average in terms of his death. So I mean, my sense was possibly that's why he doesn't enter history as much as other people do, because they really speak and write a lot more.
Perhaps also, but I just want to say also he's difficult to understand. I mean, because he's someone who understands ambivalence and can live comfortably with it, which is a very rare quality. Yeah. And to understand that, because you see all the history, when people write about nuclear power, not all of them, but some of them, you see, there's a clear stand taken. There's no ambivalence, that kind of complication is not appreciated. And so to kind of, I guess that's why maybe he slipped out a bit. That's not the only reason, but I think that's probably one reason.
Yeah. All right. Ravi, do you want to take over and ask if any of the participants want to do they have any question, or if you have any question? So owner of the bookstore must have.
Okay. Yeah. I wanted to ask, this question is for Amrita. Such an impressive, influential person on Indian scientific history, and you've written a book, one of the few. How has it been as a response, like as opposed to your other two books? Do you feel this is done relatively better in terms of actual numbers?
Oh, I mean, the book came out and then it wasn't in the market for many years. Because I think Penguin was at that point going through some kind of shift and change. And so it came out again in 2007. So it came out first in 2007 as a hardback. It was reviewed everywhere. And then it sort of disappeared. And I kept saying, kept writing and saying, well, space is, this book is sort of needed now. But it was, I think, in 2000 and I forget, I think maybe 14 that it came out again as a paperback. And I think that time has sort of, it came out at a time when again space was, now it's just everywhere and everyone talks about Sarabhai. So I think it's now become quite, I sense, I keep, seeing people mention it or put something on Twitter or, so I see there's a kind of response to it now. It was then I think it was the reviewers, it was like widely reviewed when it came out, 2007, 2008, and then it sort of slipped away, and then now again I see it. I see people reading it. I think he's such an inspirational figure. I mean, he inspires a certain. I think even if people don't know enough about him, and I think people need to know him fully. It's not just that he founded the space program, which is really critical and important, but about his whole vision. I mean, I found it quite fascinating that someone could think so widely and so in such diverse ways about, whether it was design or dance or management, bring all that together with the same scientific temperament that as Sohini kind of pointed out. So I think he's really a figure who is of the moment, and I think I get that. I sense that now. I sense that in certainly younger people. Like periodically someone will put something out on social media saying, "I just read this book," or I was, and I kind of because I was at IISc for a while, I sort of met a lot of young scientists and young students, and so many people. I mean, one student said, it took him out of his depression to read about this, and so I think there is some response now. How do I say, through him to me, whether it did better than my other books. I mean, I thought it should, because it's a biography of a person, and we have so few biographies actually, and then we have so few. I mean, people who are so kind of rich, their lives have been so rich, And I see myself as a writer, so I really write for a mass market, whether I get it or not. That's always I'm always writing for everyone to read, and for instance, if you see Kalam's book, Kalam's autobiography, Wings of Fire, that got such a great response, and I enjoyed reading it so much. I think we need this feeling of we need to enter some other mind, some other life. We need to be inspired, and I really can't think of anyone who's more inspirational than Sarabhai. And he's so off the moment, he's in some ways like he's glamorous. If you talk about a post-liberalization India, and you're talking about wealth and business and entrepreneurship, etc., he's done all that. He had all that, but yet he manages to combine that post-independence or post-colonial idealism with an understanding of how business works. He's so global, he used to go to MIT every year. He was a visiting professor there. He's traveling all over the world. I mean, I really wish I had. If you ask me, Sohini, what's the book I would write, then I would really want a very large amount of money to go everywhere he went, and and dig up stuff. And for instance, in America, a lot of papers have now come out in the public domain, so I would love to go back and look at them. Anyway, look at Pugwash papers, and anyway, lots of stuff. So that's, but so yeah. So at the moment, but I think he probably would be a more easily accessible book. I mean, I guess this one, because it deals with the person, and as I said, he really is an inspiring figure, and space is sort of right now seen as something that's very much connected with the imagination of the moment, of India at the moment. So, but I think the other books have had the television book. I mean, what I was saying would happen to the media has happened to the media 25 years after I wrote it. So we brought that book out again. And Ahmedabad is not quite understood, but it's a city. I've used the framework of a city biography to talk about India's present and future. So it's a political book. It's a biography using the city as a framing device. That's not yet understood. I mean, I think we've kind of lost that culture of conversation and discussing books in the media, So yeah, so I don't know how to answer your question about numbers yet, because, as I do.
Okay, cool. We have a couple of questions. I'll go ahead and read them. There's one which was the archival material available for your research with relative ease, or did you face any issues for your research material?
I mean, there was very little archival material. So I would say it was a difficulty. I mean, there were things like Sarabhai's speeches. Then there were sort of other people, quotes from other scientists, or particularly when he died, then kind of not obituaries, but just things people said, that kind of stuff, which is not really, it's not really personal stuff. I know, for instance, let's say, he had this, he was very, very, I mean, music was a passion for him. And I would have loved to have seen his record collection, but that, I couldn't, that wasn't there. Someone recently told me, someone kind of wrote to me saying that they happened to go to the library in where he lived, I mean, in his house, and saw a few books that had his name on it. And I was so excited because I said, okay, what were they? Which books were they? So I didn't even have that. But I had odd kinds of fragments, which were very important. I had things like, there was this British, this young man who had taught Sarabhai and the children, and he had written, it wasn't like not a published thing, he'd just written this little thing about, and that was kind of very, things like that were very useful. His thesis was very useful. Just reading his PhD thesis, the science was hard, but it was more the kind of arrangements they made and how they made them, because he recorded everything. And then his diary, I mean, as I said, it wasn't a proper diary, but the jottings really, they were great, because if you bought a tin of tobacco for P.N. Haksar, these little things, they were lovely. They really fleshed, sort of added detail and color. And then things like, so Mrinalini Sarabhai, there was a book written about her, a biography of hers written by, I think, a dancer or someone who was interested in dance. And so, they had things like that, which are not really archival in the sense that they're not, it's not raw data, but it was useful because and I had to dig it out, it was not like this book was not easily available. So I had to find it. And then I relied a lot on interviews. I interviewed a lot of people. I interviewed a lot of people from the Atomic Energy Program and space, etc.
Okay. We have one more question. On your opinion on Sarabhai's stand on the Gaganyaan project. Would he be in favor of sending humans to space, or rather focus on satellite technology for the benefit of the common man?
Yeah. So this is it's an important question. I mean, it feeds into this larger question of how we see space today. And I have to say, it's actually it's completely different from how he saw space. In fact, he very clearly said he was always worried that, because space had either been used for defense purposes, for a little bit of scientific research. I mean, scientific research following upon defense. Defense was the primary aim. And then it was used as a kind of, as a war between the US and the USSR, who's bigger. And they kept, space is very much a part of that sort of flamboyant show of, against these two superpowers. And he was very, very concerned that the space program, because he was very concerned, he knew it was a very expensive program, and it was something that was sort of a technologically sophisticated program like that. You don't see it for a poor country. And he was very kind of clear that his motive in wanting to do space was to use the highest available technology to uplift the lowest. That was the idea. And then he was very worried that it would be hijacked by that impulse of show. And I think that's to some extent what happens with the atomic energy. But to some extent, there is another strain, which is of a certain understanding of the world and understanding of global politics, which he had very clearly. Because even while he's he's saying, let's not have a nuclear demonstration because it will, it will upset all the big powers, and then we will have problems with food security, etc., which is exactly what happened. He's also not unconcerned with, he knows the balance of power. He knows global politics. He understands, and so he does, even with the bomb, for instance, he's making quiet preparations to kind of, to keep abreast of technology, okay? So to answer the question about what would he think of the space program today? As I said, first of all, yes, it's a direct contradiction, because right now I think in a way we're using space in a very flamboyant show of India, Super India, etc., which contradicts what he said at that time. He said very clearly, we don't want to send pink elephants into space, and that was in kind of because that was what the superpowers were doing at that, sending a chimpanzee to space, etc. But I don't know how that strain of realism, of understanding global politics and how to play global politics would work, how that would feed into his view of space today. Because using space to advertise India in the world is a strategy. And it's not whether I agree with it or not. I'm trying to sort of think about what Sarabhai would think of that strategy. And I am not sure, because I don't know how he would have evolved, because he always did have that, as I said, that realistic sort of understanding of the world and the need to address it in ways that were not sensible, not kind of, always make the best sense. He was strongly against it. I mean, he was very, very firmly against, doing something for show completely. But as I said, there is that, he was not like a lot of people like to say, he was woolly-headed and impractical. And I don't think he was that at all. So I can't answer it just because I think he would have been weighing all these things himself,
We have one comment more about Sarabhai's programs take education to remote villages through satellite communication and development of satellite-based remote sensing for natural resources. Maybe if you want to answer that quickly before we wrap up, because I think we're almost out of time.
I didn't get the question, Ravi. Remote sensing and
remote sensing
okay.
and satellite communication to take education to villages. It's more of a comment. It's not really a question.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's just using satellite technology for the things that now seem, just mapping is just now seen as really commonsensical, and that's what people are. But I think it was kind of interesting in the 60s to kind of think of these uses. As I said, space technology was used more for defense and scientific research.
We have maybe one quick question which says, could you please speak about Vikram's moral dilemma over nuclear weapons issue? If you want to answer, we have about a minute or so before we shut up.
Yeah, that's, I mean, it's a very critical and to me, the most fascinating question that I had to deal with in the book. But I think it's too complicated for me to give a very short answer. I mean, I would hope you would read the book, because you need to understand a lot of background before, but the dilemma itself, if I have to just sort of say it, is this, that he inherits, well, the atomic energy program in India was always a kind of dual, it had a dual purpose, but one was a sort of secret. Let's say that what we talked about was electricity, producing electricity. The defense application was not really openly talked about. Of course, it was sort of there, but it was not And that dual sort of keeping that slightly sort of mysterious, in a way helped, was important for the way global politics was playing out, the whole nuclear issue was playing out in the world. But over time, in the late 60s, I mean, it starts getting, sorry, in the late, mid 60s, early 60s, mid 60s, it starts becoming more, there's sudden kind of push towards a demonstration of our capability, whether it's for peaceful uses or whatever, kind of demonstration that India has the technology to do this. And this is a political thing as well, it's sort of, so that is the situation when Bhabha dies and Sarabhai takes over as chairman. And so there is this great push to now we will have an explosion and we will show the world. And he's trying to rein it in desperately. And the question is, why is he trying to rein it in? And that's the question I tried to kind of answer, because there's a kind of great binary in the way people see the nuclear issue, particularly as time goes on and we forget. And that's why I say, if you read the book, then you understand the context better, because we've forgotten a lot of things. We've forgotten, we've forgotten our food insecurity at the time. We've forgotten a lot of things. So, so there's a sort of idea that, he was this sort of woolly-headed, as I said, impractical, and he didn't care for defense. While on the other hand, there are other people who would say, oh, great, he was chairman of the nuclear. That means he was a hawk. So hawk or dove, and I'm trying to say that the dilemma was, it was not a hawk or dove situation for him. For him, it was a much larger, he saw the nuclear issue as part of a larger issue of India's defense. I mean, India's defense was not just having the bomb. First of all, even there he says, that if we're going to even have that, we need a whole range. We need carriers. We need sophisticated technology. We need a whole infrastructure around. We don't just produce a bomb, right? I mean, how will you kind of send it or whatever? So that's just one part of it. But he's talking about defense and security in much larger terms. He's talking about growing enough food. He's talking about getting technology imports from the world that India needed to progress. And that's really important. This is really important. And that was kind of interesting when this book came out, just after the book came out, we had that whole Manmohan Singh episode. Remember when Manmohan Singh said he staked his government, in fact, on this agreement with the Americans. And if you remember, and I thought it was very interesting because that's what Sarabhai was saying, that is the danger. The world will withdraw. We will not have the technological expertise and help that we need right now to develop. And so, but I wish we would kind of, at that point, if we can look back at history and look, because the questions come up again. And so if we kind of see how people dealt with them, as Sohini, you yourself pointed out in a way, that when you look back and understand that people thought about these things, how did they think about them? And it would help us now to kind of give us some kind of, direction.
Okay. I think we're about out of time. So I'd like to thank you very much, Amrita, for writing this fantastic book, and looking forward to you completing your next book and coming out with it. We can have a discussion on that one, on the history of your family. It sounds quite fantastic in itself. And I also want to thank Sohini for taking the time to read the book. And despite this pandemic situation, take the time out for this discussion with Amrita. And when you're in, Bangalore, let Amrita and myself know. We'll get some pizza and beer. And Amrita, when you come to Church Street, please do stop by and say hello. Yeah. thank you very much for the what do you say? Yeah, participants for coming and watching this discussion. We hope you've enjoyed it, and please do go out and buy the book, and buy it from an independent bookstore. Don't buy it online from one of the big two.
From Goobes.
Yes, buy it from Goobes.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much. Okay.
Thanks for organizing this.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ravi and Sohini. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed this.
Bye.
Bye.